Callista Marlowe never imagined that she'd one day find herself forced into a marriage with her own boss. Her life was too carefully structured for anything so dramatic. Each morning, she rose early, commuted to the sprawling corporate offices of Highland Innovations, and spent her hours immersed in marketing strategies and campaign pitches. She liked her routine, no surprises, no sudden emergencies. At least, that was true until one gray, rainy morning when she received the call that would turn her world upside down. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Ezra Radger, the founder and CEO of Highland Innovations, and Callista's direct superior. Normally, his tone was cool, clipped, and entirely self-assured. But today, there was an undercurrent of urgency she had never heard before. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that she had to come to his country estate immediately. He offered no details, just insisted it was a crisis and that she must hurry. Before she could ask a single question, he ended the call. Unease settled in the pit of her stomach. In 3 years of working under Ezra, she had never known him to sound anything but poised. Even when a client dropped a contract at the last minute or a major campaign flopped, he handled problems with a measured calm. If he was rattled now, it could only mean something catastrophic. She wanted to demand explanations, but fear of losing her job, and curiosity about what could possibly unsettle him, drove her to do as he asked. She left her apartment without even finishing her morning coffee, the unwashed dishes forgotten on the counter. The day was overcast, droplets of rain sliding across the taxi's windows as she barreled through the city traffic and out onto winding suburban roads. Her mind spun through every scenario. Had the board discovered an embezzlement scheme? Was Highland Innovations on the verge of bankruptcy? Was there a scandal brewing that could tear down the company's sterling reputation? By the time Callista's taxi pulled up at the iron gates of Ezra's estate, the rain had swelled into a steady downpour. Tall oaks lined the driveway, their branches forming a green canopy overhead. The mansion that emerged at the end of the drive looked more like a European villa than an American country house, ivory brick walls, ivy clinging to the corners, and lanterns casting warm glows along the walkway. A stern-faced attendant escorted her inside, leading her through polished marble halls into a grand living room. There, standing with his back to the fireplace, was Ezra Radger himself. He looked different from the unflappable boss she knew. The usual aura of cold confidence was replaced by grim tension in his jaw, and his blue-gray eyes flicked to hers as soon as she entered. He motioned for her to come closer, as though the words he had to say were too private for even the high ceilings to overhear. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he murmured, his voice low. She noticed his hands were clasped tightly behind his back, knuckles pale with strain. "I'm sorry to drag you out here like this, but I have no one else I can trust." The statement made her heart skip. He had always been curt, even a bit aloof, and she'd never expected him to reveal any vulnerability to her. "What's happening?" she asked, taking a step toward him. She tried to steady her tone, but the words came out tinged with worry. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as though gathering the courage to speak. Then he drew a sharp breath. "My reputation, and by extension, the company's, is on the line," he said. "Some critical investors are threatening to withdraw their support unless I fulfill certain conditions they've laid out." Her brows knitted in confusion. "Conditions?" she echoed. "What do they want from you?" Something dark flickered in Ezra's eyes, and he exhaled shakily. "They're pressuring me to settle down. They claim that the market wants a figurehead who appears stable, rooted in family values. It sounds absurd, but in these circles, appearances matter more than you'd believe. And the reality is, if I don't act, we could lose massive funding. The entire company could be jeopardized." Callista felt the tension in the room skyrocket, her pulse thudding. "You need to get married," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a punch. "To create the image of a respectable family man." Ezra gave a single nod, his expression bleak. "Exactly. I've tried ignoring the rumors and the demands, but the pressure has reached a tipping point. I have no choice. The problem is, I can't just pick someone at random. I need someone I know I can trust, not to exploit the situation or betray me later. And I need it, fast. Her stomach lurched. Fast, she repeated, her mind automatically assessing the impossibility of such a request. You can't be serious. Who on earth? He cut her off with a brisk shake of his head. I want you to do it, Callista. For an instant, she wondered if she'd misheard. But his tense demeanor said otherwise. She swayed on her feet, stunned. Me? Why would you? There must be someone else you could ask. Someone you're closer to, or at least someone who. I don't trust most people, he interjected, voice taut. And I'm out of time. You've worked under me for 3 years, you're competent, loyal, and discreet. I know how much your family depends on you. I can help them, if you'll help me. She opened her mouth to protest, but hesitated. Of course he'd noticed her monthly requests for travel reimbursements to visit her ailing father. Of course he knew she was still paying off old debts. This is insane, she breathed, fighting to stay calm. You're asking me to marry you for show. And then what? We pretend to be husband and wife indefinitely. He grimaced. Not indefinitely. We can set terms. A legal contract. Once the investors feel reassured, we'll part ways amicably. You'd be well compensated, and your position at Highland Innovations would be secure. Callista's thoughts whirled, colliding in her head. On one hand, the proposition was too outrageous to consider. On the other, if she refused, she risked angering the man who could end her career with a single word. More than that, she realized that if he truly lost his investors, she and countless others could face unemployment. Could she live with that decision if this bizarre marriage could avert disaster? She felt her gaze falter, dropping to the rich Persian rug under her feet. Ezra, this is beyond a business arrangement. It's personal. I know, he said quietly, and there was a flicker of something like regret in his expression. But I have no other choice. Her mind screamed at her that everything about this was wrong, yet some part of her recognized the desperation in his voice. She remembered how much she owed her father, how the job at Highland Innovations had been her lifeline. And if she could help save the company from a meltdown, maybe she had to try. Summoning a shaky breath, Callista lifted her eyes. If I agree, she began slowly, I want everything in writing. And I want to ensure my family is taken care of, no questions asked. Relief flared across his face, though he quickly masked it. I'll arrange the details, he said. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means. Callista nodded, feeling anything but triumphant. She had a sinking feeling that her life was about to spin out of control. But if it could protect her family, her job, and all the people relying on Highland Innovations, maybe there was no other way. She drew in a last, quivering breath, understanding that everything, her career, her future, and possibly her heart, hung on this impossible choice she was about to make. Callista spent the drive home in a fog of disbelief, fingers clenched around the steering wheel as if that alone could anchor her to reality. She had left Ezra's estate with only the vaguest plan in place. He had promised to send over a draft of their arrangement by the following afternoon, but the details still felt hazy and unreal. Each time she replayed his grim explanation in her mind, she wondered if she'd misunderstood something, but no, he had spelled it out with chilling clarity. He needed a wife for the sake of appearances, and she happened to be the only person he trusted enough to go along with it. The thought of entering a fake marriage with the man who was both her boss and an enigma filled her with a mixture of dread and reluctant curiosity. Ezra Radger was not known for soft warmth or open displays of emotion. Instead, he was the epitome of a self-made mogul, sharp-edged, controlled, and sometimes intimidating in his pursuit of success. That he had revealed even a sliver of vulnerability to her suggested the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. She pulled into her apartment complex just as twilight cast long shadows across the parking lot. Gloomy clouds overhead mirrored her mood. Inside her modest living space, she dropped her purse on the small kitchen table and sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. How was she supposed to do this? Marry a man she barely knew on a personal level, pretend to be in love for the sake of corporate optics, and remain sane? Every rational fiber in her being told her to run, but the reality was, she couldn't just vanish. She had obligations. Her family depended on her job at Highland Innovations, not to mention her own sense of responsibility to the co-workers who might lose everything if the company collapsed under a scandal. A soft buzz from her phone jolted her out of her spiraling thoughts. It was a text from her father, checking in as he usually did once every couple of days. She stared at the message for a moment, heart twisting. He had no idea what impossible choice she was facing, and she knew if he discovered she was risking her happiness for the sake of his financial security, he would protest. But how could she tell him the truth? She tapped out a generic reply, something about having a busy week, then set the phone aside, trying to tame the rising wave of guilt. The night crept by in agonizing slowness. She tried to distract herself by throwing together a simple pasta dinner, but her appetite was non-existent. She resorted to tidying her already tidy apartment, aligning books on the shelf and straightening the cushions on her couch. The mundane tasks did nothing to quiet the turmoil inside her. Eventually, she sank onto the sofa, hugging a throw pillow, and forced herself to consider the possibilities. If she did this, if she married Ezra under false pretenses, what would that mean for her future, professionally and personally? Could she maintain some semblance of normalcy? Morning arrived too soon, and with it, an email bearing the subject line, "Draft Agreement," from Ezra's personal address. Callista's heart lurched. She almost didn't open it, part of her wanting to cling to denial. But steeling herself, she clicked and began to read. The document laid out the terms methodically. They would be married for a minimum period of 6 months, during which time they would present themselves publicly as a genuine couple. After that period, if the investors remained satisfied and Highland Innovation's standing was secure, they could seek an annulment or a divorce, whichever minimized scandal. In return, Ezra would clear all of Callista's familial debts and arrange a fund for any ongoing medical or living expenses her father might need. He would also ensure her role at the company was secure, with a clear path for promotion. Both parties would sign non-disclosure clauses, promising that details of their arrangement would remain strictly confidential. There it was, spelled out like a business transaction, sterile and clinical. But the lines between the paragraphs hinted at the unsaid reality: they would have to live together in some capacity, attend corporate events side by side, and convince the board, and the public, that they had fallen in love swiftly but genuinely. It was surreal, reminiscent of the scripts from the old romantic dramas Callista's mother used to watch. Except in those films, the characters always ended up discovering actual love. Real life seldom worked that way. Arriving at the office that day felt like stepping into a strange new world. She moved through the familiar lobby, scanning her ID badge at the turnstile, but everything felt shifted in perspective. Colleagues bustled by with coffees and briefcases, greeting her with the usual polite nods, unaware that her entire life had changed overnight. She swallowed her nerves and headed up to her floor. There was no special meeting on her calendar. She had half expected to see a note from Ezra summoning her to some private conference room. But her schedule looked normal: a mid-morning presentation with the marketing team, followed by a lunch meeting with an external agency. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the agreement, its stark words looping in her head. Right before noon, she felt a presence at her side. Startled, she glanced up from her computer to see Ezra standing there, expression calm yet intent. "Come to my office after you've had lunch," he said quietly, voice low enough that no one else could overhear. "We should finalize the details." Her pulse stuttered. "Oh, okay," she managed. He gave a curt nod, then strode away with the same controlled posture that exuded command. She stared after him, stomach knotting. It was happening, no more time to second-guess. The midday hours crawled by. She tried to scarf down a sandwich at her desk but barely tasted it. When the clock neared 1, she headed to the executive suite, receiving a wary glance from one of the secretaries. The rumor mill at Highland Innovations was always hungry for gossip, and Callista dreaded the day it might uncover the truth of her arrangement. But she had no choice. Chin up, she approached Ezra's door and tapped lightly. "Come in," he called. The space beyond was all glass and steel, sleek furniture, and city views that stretched to the horizon. He sat behind a desk littered with documents, though his attention was pinned on her the moment she stepped inside. Without preamble, he gestured to a nearby chair. She took it, smoothing the skirt of her tailored dress in a futile attempt to steady her nerves. "I assume you read the draft," he said, clasping his hands together on the desk. "Any concerns or changes?" Callista wet her lips, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "It's extremely thorough." "I suppose that's good, given the gravity of the situation." "But 6 months," she hesitated. "Is that really enough time to convince your investors you're in a stable marriage?" Ezra's jaw tightened slightly. "They want to see I'm capable of genuine commitment. 6 months should do it, if we're careful. If the board remains unconvinced, we can always extend it." The thought of living in a staged marriage for longer than half a year made her chest constrict. "I see." She paused, gathering courage. "I appreciate that you're including help for my father's debts. That means more than I can say." His eyes flicked with a hint of empathy. "I'm not doing this lightly, Callista. I understand the sacrifice I'm asking of you. You shouldn't have to carry that burden without something in return." Silence stretched between them. She could almost sense the unspoken tension, the knowledge that once they signed this agreement, their lives would fuse in a way that defied reason. Despite the raw absurdity of it, something like resolve took root in her chest. If she was really going through with this, she intended to do it on her own terms. "Then let's finalize it," she said, voice quieter than she intended. "I'll want a separate clause ensuring that should anything go wrong, if, say, the marriage ends earlier than we expect, my job is still protected. I can't risk everything." Ezra nodded, picking up a pen. "That's fair. I'll have legal add that clause. Anything else?" For a moment, she wondered if she should bring up emotional boundaries, the question of whether they'd have to share living space or even a bedroom. But the notion made her cheeks flame. Instead, she shook her head. "No, that's all." He scribbled a note on a pad, likely to pass along to the company's legal team. Then he rose and extended a hand, as though sealing a business deal. She stood as well, heart hammering, and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm. Her breath caught, awareness singing through her that this was no ordinary handshake. They were about to become man and wife, on paper, at least, and the entire arrangement hung precariously on trust and secrecy. "Thank you," he murmured, withdrawing his hand after what felt like too long. "I'll call you once the revised document is ready. We can set a timeline for the ceremony." The ceremony. Wedding. Those words chimed in her head, simultaneously ridiculous and frighteningly real. She managed a tight nod, then turned on her heel and left, ignoring the curious stares of executive assistants as she hurried back to the safety of her own department. Once in the elevator, she closed her eyes, trying to slow her racing pulse. She couldn't help recalling the strange flicker in Ezra's eyes when they shook hands, a blend of relief, guilt, and maybe a hint of gratitude. Returning to her desk, Callista forced her mind onto the marketing reports piling up in her inbox. The tasks felt hollow, overshadowed by the knowledge that her life was about to change in ways she'd never imagined. Yet she fought to maintain a semblance of normalcy. After all, no one else knew about this insane plan. If they sensed her distraction, they'd ask questions, and she had no decent answers to give. As the day wore on, she tried to find comfort in the hum of routine, drafting slides and emailing clients. But beneath every keystroke lurked the realization that soon, within days, if not weeks, she would stand at some form of altar or courthouse, pretending to love a man she barely knew beyond the realm of business. And the strangest part was that in doing so, she might save them both, or she might destroy everything she'd worked for. Only time would tell. Callista spent the following days half in a daze, balancing her usual workload with furtive planning for the impending marriage she still struggled to believe was real. Whenever she allowed herself a moment of reflection, her heart would pound at the thought of publicly pledging her life to a man she knew mostly through boardroom interactions. Yet each time fear reared its head, she recalled her father's health struggles, the delicate state of Highland innovations, and the looming possibility that if she refused to go along with Ezra's plan, the company, and countless jobs, could be in jeopardy. A sense of duty, both personal and professional, kept her pushing forward. She finalized her portion of the agreement's clauses by email, clarifying details about her father's debts, her salary security, and how the practicalities of their living situation would work. Ezra responded with swift, unemotional confirmations. The speed with which he acted left her little time to doubt. It felt as though he was determined to remove any barriers that might make her second-guess. He even arranged for a lawyer to speak with her directly, ensuring she understood every legal nuance. At one point, the lawyer asked if she felt coerced, an obligatory step to confirm she wasn't under duress. Callista swallowed hard, knowing the question was more complicated than a simple yes or no. On paper, it was her choice. In reality, it felt like fate had cornered her. When the final draft was ready, she found herself ushered into a private room beside Ezra's office, with a notary present to witness her signature. The whole scene felt oddly mechanical: crisp papers, the scratch of pen on the dotted lines, an exchange of solemn nods that seemed far removed from any notion of romance. Ezra offered a subdued "thank you" once she had signed, sliding the documents into a leather-bound folder. She mumbled a polite acknowledgement, forcing herself not to dwell on the fact that she had just agreed, in writing, to become someone's wife under false pretenses. Back in her department, Callista noticed the undercurrent of gossip buzzing around her. She could see subtle changes in the way certain coworkers interacted with her. Some treated her with newfound deference, while a few shot curious or even suspicious looks. Rumors likely stemmed from the fact that she'd been repeatedly summoned to the executive suite, normally a cause for speculation. Whenever colleagues asked if something big was happening, she deflected with vague references to new projects. Yet she knew it was only a matter of time before people started connecting dots about her sudden involvement with Ezra's world. Ezra himself kept a purposeful distance at work, rarely speaking to her outside of arranged meetings about corporate campaigns. In those moments, he was as poised as ever, speaking in clipped, measured tones, focusing on metrics rather than anything personal. Callista wondered if he was deliberately trying not to attract attention, or if he simply had no idea how to navigate the new reality between them. Oddly enough, that professional aloofness made her uncertain which version of Ezra she'd encounter once they had to begin presenting themselves as an engaged couple. One afternoon, toward the end of the week, she received a short, unexpected message from him. He asked her to meet at a discreet event planning studio in a quieter part of the city, providing just enough detail for her to guess that it had to do with their upcoming ceremony. Her stomach lurched, the finality of it pressing down on her. After work, she took a cab to the address, a converted loft overlooking a calm river. The walls inside were lined with catalogs displaying wedding themes, floral arrangements, and every other detail one might need to stage a perfect, if hastily arranged, marriage. Ezra arrived minutes later, removing his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves as though the place made him uncomfortable. Callista realized with a jolt that he likely found this entire situation just as surreal as she did. He greeted her with a polite dip of his chin, then explained, in low, rapid words, that they needed to finalize the logistics, a basic guest list, a date only a handful of days away, and small details like what the bride would wear. She tried to offer opinions, selecting a modest ceremony plan that would draw minimal press coverage, while he nodded or shook his head, making occasional phone calls to ensure no paparazzi or unwelcome journalists would slip in. Somewhere between choosing a pale floral scheme and confirming how many seats they'd need, Callista felt the reality sink in fully. She would be standing at an altar, or maybe just a quiet courthouse area, that part wasn't settled yet, with this man, reciting vows that were essentially a charade. Anxiety churned inside her. She risked a glance at Ezra, wondering if he shared that sense of confusion, but he seemed intent on each practical detail, refusing to let emotion break through his businesslike facade. Only once, toward the end of the planning session, did his mask crack. When the planner, a friendly woman who believed this to be a whirlwind romance, offered them a sample vow to consider, Ezra's posture tensed. He took the sheet of paper but didn't read it, simply sliding it aside and politely, but firmly, stating they'd have their own vows prepared. Callista didn't miss the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. The moment passed quickly, overshadowed by further talk about schedules and location details, but it lingered in Callista's mind as a reminder that she wasn't the only one feeling ill at ease with this ruse. By the time they left, night had fallen over the city. They stepped onto a dimly lit street corner, the air cool against Callista's face. She hesitated, half expecting some closing remark, a reassurance from him that everything would be okay, or at least an acknowledgement of how bizarre this all was. Instead, he offered a short nod, thanked her for her time, and strode off to his car with the same brisk stride he used when leaving board meetings. She stood there for a long moment, hugging her coat around herself. Then she ordered a ride home, her mind buzzing with the day's revelations. It struck her, with crushing clarity, that she was hurtling into a bond that would never be built on love or genuine affection, not at first, anyway. She wondered how she would endure the demands of maintaining such a facade and whether it would erode what little sense of stability she had left. As the car carried her back to her small apartment, she caught sight of her reflection in the window, wide-eyed, tense, and undeniably anxious about what lay ahead. Within days, she would be someone's wife, a position she'd never envisioned herself in, at least not under these circumstances. She let out a shaky breath, vowing to keep her emotions in check. She reminded herself that this was for her father's sake, for Highland Innovations, for everyone who needed the company to stay afloat. She had sacrificed bigger things in her past to protect her loved ones. Surely she could endure a temporary marriage to an enigmatic boss who, for all his flaws, was desperate enough to ask for her help. Still, a deep part of her whispered that every choice has a price. And this choice, this forced step into an arranged union, might cost her more than she dared to imagine. Callista found herself juggling two entirely separate realities as the wedding date crept closer. By day, she continued her duties in the marketing department, fielding emails from clients and diligently preparing for an upcoming product launch. Those were the hours when she could almost forget the charade looming in the background, almost. Then the after-work hours arrived, and she'd be swept into a whirlwind of preparations with Ezra's hand-picked planner, reviewing seating charts, attire options, and the logistics of how to present themselves as a couple deeply in love. Each detail sharpened the unnerving truth: in less than a week, she would walk down an aisle, of sorts, and exchange vows with her boss to bolster his public image and protect her own future. In the midst of this chaos, Callista also felt compelled to visit her father, who lived in a smaller town about an hour's drive away. She had delayed telling him anything about her upcoming marriage, unsure of how to break the news that she was marrying a near stranger for business reasons. One drizzly Saturday, she made the trip, hoping to maintain her usual composed front. Stepping into the modest home where she'd grown up, she was greeted by the familiar scent of old books and the comforting warmth of a well-worn armchair. Her father sat by a window, reading a newspaper with pursed lips. Though his health had declined over the past year, he still exuded a quiet dignity. When he saw her, his face lit up with genuine delight. They spent the afternoon chatting about everyday matters: her father's new medication, the small garden he tried to tend, and neighborhood gossip, but Callista felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. Finally, after she'd helped clear the dishes from an early dinner, her father noticed her distraction. He asked gently if something was wrong. She hesitated, dread coiling in her stomach, and settled on a half-truth. She mentioned a major life change was on the horizon. She confessed she'd be getting married soon, omitting the contractual nature and citing only that it was a sudden decision connected to her role at Highland Innovations. When he offered confused congratulations, she struggled to smile, heart twisting at the deception. If her father realized how uneasy she felt, he didn't push the subject, but a shadow of worry lingered in his eyes. Returning to the city that evening, Callista found her phone buzzing with a message from Ezra. It was a short text about the final fitting for her wedding attire. The planner had arranged an appointment the next day, and he wanted to confirm she'd be there on time. Reading his terse instructions, she felt a pang of resentment. He didn't bother asking about her father or how she was coping. Then again, she reminded herself, this marriage was a transaction for him, not a romantic union. It struck her how lonely this entire ordeal was. She was essentially orchestrating a lavish performance, with only a small circle of people aware that it was all for show. The two of them might stand at the center of the ceremony, but in truth, they were both alone in their separate anxieties. Monday arrived, bringing with it the final days before the ceremony. Callista's colleagues seemed more watchful than ever. Some offered polite comments about how she appeared stressed, others whispered behind her back. She forced herself to remain calm, to respond with the usual pleasantries, but her heart pounded every time her gaze landed on the calendar. The wedding was set for Saturday, barely 5 days away, and there was still much to do. Ezra, as always, carried himself with stoic determination, holding private phone calls and briefings to ensure everything was managed. Whenever their paths crossed, he'd give her the briefest nod, as though acknowledging that their unspoken pact was racing toward fulfillment. In those fleeting moments, Callista wondered if he felt any trace of the same apprehension that dogged her every step, or if he truly believed he could keep his personal feelings locked away, unaffected by the enormity of what they were about to do. Callista never expected the final stretch of days before the wedding to feel this claustrophobic. She was juggling a seemingly endless list of obligations, preparing her department's materials for an upcoming executive review, confirming last-minute details for the ceremony, and working overtime to keep any hint of her predicament from reaching the office rumor mill. Each morning, she woke with her heart pounding, wishing she had more time to think, or to run, before she was locked into a vow that wasn't rooted in real love. Yet each night, she fell into bed, exhausted and too preoccupied to sleep soundly. Ezra's planner contacted her almost daily with updates. The ceremony, though modest in scale, demanded precise coordination, a short guest list featuring mostly investors and a few close associates, a subdued yet elegant floral theme, and a formal dinner afterward that served as a chance for the board to see their CEO's happy union. Callista felt her stomach knot every time she saw the wedding schedule. She dreaded standing before an audience and playing the part of a devoted bride, even as she tried to remind herself that it was all for the greater good. During lunch breaks, she found herself cornered by well-meaning coworkers who sensed something was off. One day, Serena, an acquaintance from the finance department, sidled up to Callista with a concerned expression and whispered, "I've heard all sorts of things. Are you in trouble? Is your job on the line?" Callista forced a tight smile, feigning ignorance. She could see that her habitual calm was wearing thin. The tension around her was palpable, and every curious look felt like a spotlight on the secret that weighed her down. Ezra, meanwhile, managed to keep a deliberate distance. He summoned her only for essential discussions about the ceremony logistics and Highland Innovations updates, taking care to limit their interactions within view of others. When they did speak behind closed doors, it was hurried and businesslike, each of them maintaining a veneer of calm. But Callista couldn't shake the impression that beneath his polished exterior, a whirlwind of anxiety brewed just as fiercely as her own. She glimpsed it in the way he absent-mindedly tapped his pen on the desk or cut conversations short as though afraid to delve too deeply. Then, 2 days before the wedding, Callista received a short, unexpected text from him, "Meet me at the Westbridge Hotel lounge after work. We need to talk, off the record." The directness of his words sent her nerves flaring. She responded with a curt acknowledgement, bracing herself for whatever twist he might have to share. The rest of the day felt interminable, her thoughts tumbling in circles about the possible reasons he wanted to meet in such a setting. By the time evening arrived, Callista found herself walking into the sleek, low-lit lounge of the Westbridge Hotel, scanning the plush seating areas for any sign of Ezra. He was seated in a corner booth, posture rigid, gaze flicking toward the entrance every few seconds. When he noticed her, he lifted a hand in a subtle wave. She slid into the seat across from him, feeling a disconcerting ache in her chest at how surreal it all seemed. Here they were, just days away from a marriage that bound them by contract, not by choice. He looked uncharacteristically worn, dark circles under his eyes betraying his usual mask of confidence. "I'm sorry for the secrecy," he began quietly, leaning forward so their conversation remained private. "I didn't want to risk being overheard at the office. Things have escalated." Alarm prickled at Callista's spine. "Escalated how? Is the board unhappy with the plan?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Some directors are questioning whether this sudden wedding will truly fix the company's image problem. They want proof it's genuine, public outings, extra scrutiny on how we conduct ourselves as a couple. The eyes of the media might be more intense than we expected." A weight pressed down on Callista's chest. She already dreaded the performance they were about to stage, now it would be magnified. "So we have to pretend even more convincingly," she said, her tone hollow. Ezra nodded, frustration etching lines into his features. "Yes. And there's another potential complication, a certain journalist who's been sniffing around. If they discover this marriage is a sham. I don't need to spell out how disastrous that would be." The urge to laugh bitterly rose in her throat, but she forced it down. "Then we have no choice but to play our roles perfectly," she murmured, stirring the ice in the untouched glass of water in front of her. "Even if it means letting the world believe we're hopelessly in love." For a moment, Ezra didn't reply. The lounge's dim lighting cast shadows across his face, making him look more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Finally, he reached across the table, resting his hand on hers, a brief contact that startled her with its warmth. "I know I'm asking too much," he said softly, eyes meeting hers. "But we're in this together. I won't let you shoulder all the pressure alone." Something inside her shifted, a pang of empathy mingling with her lingering resentment. Here he was, a man used to bending circumstances to his will, openly admitting he needed her. "Then we do it," she whispered, mustering a brave nod. "Whatever it takes to make the wedding believable." They discussed strategies for the next hour, huddled over the table like conspirators mapping out a mission. They agreed to stage a few public appearances in advance, to let the paparazzi snap photos of them acting affectionate, within reason. At one point, he glanced at her with faint uncertainty, as though testing how far she was willing to go. She swallowed her nerves and agreed to the plan, knowing there was no alternative if she wanted to safeguard her future and his. They left the lounge separately, fading into the city night like ghosts carrying secrets. On the taxi ride home, Callista stared at the blurred lights outside, her mind a mix of trepidation and a strange, unbidden sympathy for Ezra's plight. In 2 days, she would stand by his side, wearing a wedding gown carefully chosen to look understated but elegant. She would vow loyalty, for better or worse, all in the presence of the corporate world's watchful eyes. And in that thought, she felt the magnitude of what she was about to do. This union might shield them from scandal, but it would also lock them in a shared spotlight, where every moment risked being dissected by cynics and outsiders. The line between truth and artifice would blur dangerously, and Callista couldn't help but wonder which part of herself might get lost in the process. Callista never thought a single day could feel quite so suffocating. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, as if mocking the knot of anxiety in her chest. She woke before sunrise, having spent a sleepless night running through every possible misstep. Despite the careful rehearsal, the hush of the pre-dawn hours brought a raw awareness that there was no turning back. By evening, she would be bound to Ezra in a ceremony meant to fool the world into believing in their love story. She arrived at the small estate on the outskirts of the city just as the planners began their final checks. The grounds were manicured to perfection, flowers arranged in neat clusters along a short aisle. Seats had been set up for only a handful of attendees, mostly key investors, board members, and a few wary reporters invited to witness this so-called intimate celebration. Callista's heart drummed as she stepped inside a room that had been designated for her preparations. An assistant promptly steered her toward a lace-trimmed gown hanging in protective plastic. It was elegant yet understated, chosen to project refinement without opulence. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling an odd detachment, as though observing someone else's life. In the flurry of makeup and hairstyling, her mind drifted. She recalled the final texts she and Ezra had exchanged the night before, detailing the sequence of events, when she'd appear at the aisle, how they'd exchange vows, the brief reception to follow. His messages remained cool, almost clinical, despite a subtle thread of nerves beneath. She wondered if he, too, had spent a sleepless night wrestling with what they were about to do, or if he had managed to compartmentalize everything, as he did with so many corporate issues. Just before noon, the assistant ushered her outside to a small terrace behind the estate. Soft music played over hidden speakers, mingling with the scent of fresh roses. She scanned the gathering guests, dozens of well-dressed men and women conversing quietly, casting occasional glances at the spot where the ceremony would take place. Cameras were present, though not in overwhelming numbers, snapping discreet photos for the business pages rather than tabloid headlines. Even so, Callista felt exposed. Her gaze landed on a pair of older board members who eyed her with reserved smiles, perhaps still unconvinced of her genuine affection for the man she was about to marry. Moments later, Ezra appeared at the end of the aisle, wearing a tailored suit that fit him like a second skin. He projected his usual air of composure, though she noticed a slight tension in his posture. Their gazes met briefly, a fleeting moment of mutual acknowledgement that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no easy return. Then the music swelled, signaling for the ceremony to begin. Callista's feet carried her forward almost of their own accord. She tried to breathe steadily, to keep her face calm, mindful of the guests' watchful eyes. She reached the front, taking her place across from Ezra. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a trace of something, maybe apology, maybe relief, or perhaps it was as much of both as she felt. The officiant, carefully chosen by the planner, welcomed everyone with a polished speech about love's power to bring two people together. Callista's heart hammered at the irony. She cast a quick glance at the audience, board members, investors, a smattering of PR personnel. They watched with expectant faces, as if hungry for any sign of sincerity that might confirm this was a real union. When the officiant invited the couple to speak their vows, Ezra began first. He'd prepared a short statement, presumably penned by him or his public relations team. He talked about finding an unexpected bond, about how business partnership had turned into something deeper. Though his words were carefully crafted, the waver in his voice was genuine, betraying more nerves than his steady gaze let on. Then it was Callista's turn. She hadn't memorized her lines as thoroughly, partly out of a stubborn refusal to let it feel like a script. Yet as she began, she discovered a strange clarity overtaking her. She spoke of trust, of respect, of the future they would build together, sentiments that sounded heartfelt even though she knew the marriage was anything but traditional. Her voice shook at the edges, but the audience seemed enchanted, as if they'd fallen for the performance she and Ezra had orchestrated. The exchange of rings was surreal. The metal band felt cool against her skin, symbolizing a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. She glanced at Ezra, hoping to read some reassurance in his face, but found only tense determination. Finally, the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. A ripple of applause moved through the onlookers. For a moment, Callista stood there stunned, until Ezra leaned in to press a light kiss against her lips, the final seal of this grand facade. Flashes from the photographers captured that moment, preserving it as evidence of a union the world was meant to believe. Callista's stomach churned with conflicting emotions, relief that the ceremony was over, dread of the reception still ahead, and a strange twinge in her chest at the intimacy of Ezra's brief touch. They turned to face the crowd, smiling as though elated, while inside her mind swirled with the knowledge that they were now legally bound, a married couple on paper. The reception that followed was a small but polished affair, tables set with fine linens, a catered buffet, soft music drifting from a hired quartet. Callista played her part to perfection, standing by Ezra's side as he introduced her to key figures in the business world. She nodded politely at their well wishes, feigned a blush when someone teased them about honeymoon plans, and stayed close enough to Ezra that no one could question their rapport. In the corners of her vision, she spotted a few cameras capturing each moment. She hoped the pictures told a convincing story of a newlywed pair basking in the happiness of their wedding day. As evening descended, the final guests offered congratulations and departed. With the crowd dwindling, the tension slowly ebbed from Callista's shoulders, replaced by bone-deep fatigue. Now came the question of what to do next. Would they retreat to separate rooms in the estate, or would they maintain appearances by departing together as though they had a honeymoon to look forward to? She felt a flicker of gratitude that, at least for tonight, the elaborate show could wind down. Ezra found her by one of the garden arches, hands clasped in front of her, staring at the fading sunlight. He approached quietly, offering a small, tentative smile that looked more genuine than anything she'd seen from him all day. "You did well," he said, voice still subdued. "I'm sure everyone is convinced." She let out a weary laugh, her gaze drifting to the ring on her finger. "I hope so. We can't afford any doubts." For a moment, she hesitated, recalling the vow she'd spoken only hours earlier and wondering how they could possibly navigate the reality now that the crowds were gone. He seemed to share that uncertainty, exhaling softly. "Let's head inside. We can decide the rest of our schedule tomorrow. There's no point in dragging this night out any longer." Callista nodded, following him back into the estate's interior. The hush of the foyer enveloped them, as though they'd stepped from a theater stage into a backstage quiet. She had the fleeting sensation that they'd both just delivered a performance that would earn critical acclaim in the business world, but at the cost of their personal sense of normalcy. The door closed behind them, and in the silent expanse of the hall, she realized that while the wedding might be over, the real challenge, learning to live this lie day in and day out, was just beginning. Callista awoke the next morning with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Her gaze flitted across the lavish guest suite in Ezra's estate, dark paneled walls, thick drapes, and a subtle floral arrangement that reminded her of the day before. With a jolt, she remembered, she was now Mrs. Radger, at least in the public eye. The ceremony had ended only hours ago, yet it felt both surreal and inescapably real. She pressed a hand to her temple, trying to stem the tide of questions about what came next. A series of soft knocks on the door jarred her from her thoughts. She sat up, smoothing the covers, and cleared her throat. "Come in." An attendant peered inside, offering a polite good morning and asking if she needed anything, coffee, breakfast, perhaps. Callista almost declined out of reflex, but the gnawing emptiness in her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten much at the reception. She requested a simple meal, too worn out for lavish cuisine. While she waited, she flipped through her phone. The news outlets and corporate newsletters were already abuzz with headlines and photos from the wedding. Most pieces lauded Ezra's romantic surprise, how the private CEO had, out of nowhere, found love with one of Highland Innovation's rising stars. One particularly glowing article described Callista's calm grace and the earnest affection between them. She felt a pang in her chest reading that phrase, because it was all show. Yet the pictures indeed showed her smiling up at him, a look that even she had to admit seemed tender. Maybe they had convinced the cameras better than she'd realized. The attendant returned with a tray, placing it on a small table by the window. Callista thanked her and picked at a fresh croissant, scanning her calendar. She was supposed to be out of the office for a few days, an unofficial honeymoon. It had been the PR team's suggestion for the sake of authenticity, though she and Ezra were merely staying in separate parts of his estate. The thought of continuing this charade so intensively made her heart hammer. But she wanted to maintain her calm, if only to ensure no suspicion arose about their union. Midway through breakfast, there was another knock, this one firm and unmistakably purposeful. She braced herself, calling out for whoever it was to enter. The door swung open, and Ezra stepped in, his expression guarded yet free of the tension that had marked their every interaction lately. He wore a crisp shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, looking as if he'd been up for hours handling early calls. "May I come in?" he asked politely, and she nodded, gesturing toward the seating area near the window. He settled into one of the plush chairs, maintaining a respectful distance. For a few beats, neither spoke. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air between them. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I wanted to check on you. The last 24 hours have been intense." He paused, searching her face for some sign of how she was holding up. She forced a hint of a smile. "Intense is an understatement, but I'm all right. Tired, mostly." He nodded, gaze flicking to the breakfast tray. "I'm glad you're taking a moment to recharge. We don't have any official appearances today, unless we decide to step out together for the paparazzi's benefit." Callista winced at the reminder of how contrived their life now was. "Is that necessary? We just had a very public ceremony." Ezra exhaled slowly. "Probably not. The PR team suggested it, but I think we have enough coverage for the moment. I'd rather let the news cycle do its work. Everyone's abuzz with our romance." His tone dripped with a self-aware irony that echoed her own unease. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Callista was acutely aware of the ring on her finger and the sense that they were newlyweds with no real marital bond. She wondered if he felt the same strain, the knowledge that they should act closer, do the little things couples did, yet had nothing truly intimate to fall back on. He seemed to weigh his words before speaking. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," he said quietly. "It might help if we put in some effort to get to know each other better. I realize we've worked together for years, but that's not the same as being married." He grimaced, as though the word itself tasted strange. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't expected him to suggest such a thing, but it made sense. "That might be wise," she agreed carefully. "If we're going to sell the idea that we're building a life together, we should have some common ground." He offered a fleeting, almost shy smile. "Precisely. Maybe we can start small. We could have dinner tonight, just us. No staff fussing, no business talk, at least, not entirely. And we can see what it's like to have an actual conversation outside the corporate bubble." The suggestion hung in the air, startling Callista with the possibility that maybe he did feel a shred of responsibility to make this situation less painful. Her tension eased a fraction. "All right," she murmured. "Dinner sounds good. 7 o'clock in the dining room, if that works," he said, standing with a quiet resolve. "I'll arrange for something simple. We don't need all the pomp at home." She nodded, hugging her arms around herself as he turned to leave. Before he reached the door, though, she found herself blurting out a question. "Ezra, are you okay with all of this? I know it's your idea, but it can't be easy." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a brief moment, a crack appeared in the wall of composure he wore like armor. "I'm managing," he admitted in a low voice. "I don't regret asking you. But I can't pretend it's not a constant weight. Every time I remember it's not real, he shook his head, letting the words die. Then, with a final nod, he stepped out. Callista stared at the closed door for a long time, heart pounding. She hadn't anticipated the faint flicker of empathy she felt for him. If he was struggling too, maybe she wasn't entirely alone in this. The day ahead felt slightly less daunting, knowing they were both grappling with the same uneasy reality. When evening arrived, she dressed in a casual but tasteful outfit, a soft sweater and a simple skirt. Nothing about this dinner was typical date night attire, yet she wanted to be comfortable and show a little more warmth than she did in the office. She made her way downstairs, following the muted light into the formal dining room. Candles flickered atop a long table set for two, the flames reflecting in silverware polished to a high gleam. A staff member had clearly arranged the scene, but had been instructed to keep it understated: no extravagant centerpieces, no lavish floral displays. Ezra was already seated, nursing a glass of wine. He stood when she entered, gesturing for her to take the seat across from him. They exchanged polite smiles, and for a moment, Callista felt a pang of nerves reminiscent of a first date. Except this was not a normal first date, it was a forced marriage's attempt at normalcy. The meal was served course by course, each dish prepared with careful finesse, yet the atmosphere remained subdued. They started with idle chit-chat, the day's headlines, a snippet about an upcoming marketing campaign. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward more personal territory. Ezra asked about her father, and she provided a glimpse into her childhood, how she'd grown up in a small town with big dreams of making it in the corporate world. Her father had always supported her ambitions, even when finances were tight. Ezra listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest. He admitted he hadn't been close to his own parents, that his success stemmed from a relentless drive to prove himself. The more they talked, the more Callista realized how little she truly knew about the man behind the tailored suits and stoic demeanor. He described the early days of Highland Innovations, the late nights spent in half-empty offices, hustling for funding, braving constant doubts from those who thought he was too young to lead. She found herself unexpectedly captivated by the story, empathizing with the sheer grit it must have taken to build an empire from scratch. As dessert arrived, an elegant chocolate torte, Ezra's tone shifted. "You must think it's absurd, me wanting to preserve the company's image through a marriage," he said quietly, swirling the last of his wine. "But there are so many subtle politics at play. Investors who believe that a CEO should have a stable personal life, a wife at his side. It's archaic, but it influences stock prices, morale, everything." She sighed. "I don't think it's absurd, exactly. Just, unfair that you're forced into a corner. That we both are." She paused, then ventured, "Does it bother you that people might see us as a PR stunt?" His lips curved in a humorless smile. "Of course. But that's the game, isn't it? They care about perception, not reality. We're just ensuring the perception is favorable. If it keeps the company afloat and our employees secure, perhaps it's a lesser evil." Their gazes met across the candlelit table, a shared understanding passing between them. This was their rationale, that their facade served a purpose beyond personal gain. Callista caught herself wishing it all felt less hollow, that the sense of duty could meld with a genuine emotion that wasn't so burdened by secrecy. But she tamped the thought down, reminding herself that this was temporary, a means to an end. The night concluded more amiably than she'd expected. After dinner, they strolled briefly through the mansion's garden, exchanging a few more fragments of their life stories, neither pressing too deep. When they reached the grand foyer, they said goodnight, still two separate individuals with little in the way of real intimacy, yet bound by circumstances that demanded closeness. Callista climbed the stairs to her guest suite, her mind churning with the day's revelations. Lying in bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, she mulled over the gentle smiles and earnest questions they'd shared during dinner. Beneath the layers of tension and obligation, she sensed the faintest possibility that they might navigate this ruse with kindness. They might even discover a connection that surprised them both. Yet a kernel of doubt remained lodged in her chest, reminding her that once the investors were reassured, their arrangement could unravel, leaving them with nothing but the memory of nights like this one, a fragile attempt at forging something real in a marriage built on illusions. Callista spent the next few days reeling from the quiet, delicate balance that defined her new married life. The public scrutiny subsided a little after the initial flurry of articles and photos, allowing her to slip back into daily routines, at least on the surface. She resumed overseeing key projects in the marketing department, fielding the usual emails and phone calls, but behind her calm efficiency lay the knowledge that she was no longer just an employee, she was now the CEO's wife, with a ring and a contract to prove it. Sometimes, she glanced at that band of gold on her finger and felt an almost guilty pang. The marriage might be real in a legal sense, yet the love behind it remained a carefully constructed fiction. Ezra continued to maintain the same disciplined veneer at the office, but whenever they were home at the estate, or wherever they had to appear together, she saw glimpses of something else. He'd inquire about her father's health in a tone that suggested genuine concern, or he'd notice if she seemed overwhelmed and quietly suggest they cancel a public outing. It was a subtle shift from the icy determination she'd always associated with him. Though they had never been exactly friends, she realized with a wistful pang that they were starting to form a tenuous companionship. There was no denying that he, too, was bound up in this act, and the strain weighed on him as much as it did her. A week after their subdued wedding, the board of Highland Innovations convened for a quarterly review, an event Callista always attended in her capacity as a lead strategist in the marketing department. This time, however, her presence carried an entirely different resonance. People who once glanced over her now approached with beaming smiles, referencing her new life or offering personal congratulations. She felt a flush creep across her cheeks each time someone commented on her and Ezra's supposed whirlwind romance. But she nodded, forced a pleasant grin, and repeated her half-rehearsed statements about how grateful she was. The entire performance left her exhausted, but the corners of her mind kept returning to a single question: how much longer could they fake it before the strain cracked through? During the meeting, Ezra presented a major new initiative, bolstered by the renewed confidence of investors who seemed finally at ease with the stability his marriage signified. The corporate world, it appeared, valued the image of a settled, domestically content CEO above any personal authenticity. Callista sat through the presentations and updates with a strange, hollow sense of relief. The strategy was working. The company's stock prices were inching upward, and the tension that had threatened to torpedo everything was easing. Yet instead of celebration, she found herself carrying a quiet dread. What would happen once all these onlookers deemed their performance sufficient? They'd likely break the marriage, returning to separate lives as if none of this had happened. A part of her insisted that was what she wanted. After all, this entire arrangement was built on a lie. Another part of her, however, felt an unsettling twinge whenever she pictured walking away from the strange closeness she'd started to feel with him. That uneasy question hung in the air one afternoon as she headed back to the estate, driving alone while Ezra stayed behind for a series of extended meetings. She relished the solitude, needing time to reflect. The day's sky was clear, the sun warm on the windshield, a deceptive calm, given her tumultuous thoughts. She let herself imagine, just for a moment, a scenario in which they gradually discovered a real foundation beneath their public sham. The fantasy made her heart flutter, but she tried to dismiss it. Hoping for genuine emotion in a contract marriage was nothing but a recipe for heartbreak. Upon arriving, she found an unwelcome surprise waiting for her, a sleek black car parked at the end of the estate's driveway. A figure stood by the gates, camera in hand, scanning the premises. Her stomach clenched, clearly a journalist, or perhaps a gossip site photographer, hunting for the sort of candid shots that might unravel any half-baked illusions of a perfect marriage. Steeling her nerves, she parked and tried to ignore the stranger's presence as she walked inside. But dread gnawed at her, reminding her how vulnerable their arrangement was to any prying lens that caught them off guard. Less than an hour later, as she worked quietly in the estate study, she heard the front doors open and the echo of brisk footsteps. She emerged to find Ezra shutting the doors with barely restrained irritation. One glance at his taut expression, and she knew something was wrong. "We have a problem," he muttered in lieu of a greeting, removing his jacket and tossing it onto a nearby chair. "That journalist outside is the least of it." Her heart thumped. What happened? He raked a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps. "We just got word from an internal source. Someone on the board is feeding rumors to an investigative reporter. They suspect our marriage isn't real, and they're gathering evidence. Bank records, timeline inconsistencies, whatever they can dig up to prove we staged this entire thing." A chill ran through her. She exhaled slowly, trying to keep calm. If they succeed, the scandal could be massive, right? It could destroy the trust we've built, send the stock tanking, maybe even cost both of us our careers. His nod was grim. Yes, it could. And the board, some of them might call for my resignation. The entire scheme would be undone. Everything we did to keep the company afloat would backfire. His gaze flicked to her, the faint lines of strain etched around his eyes. "I'm sorry. This is exactly what I tried to prevent." She swallowed hard, words forming in a quiet rush. Then we have to counter it, immediately. We can't just wait for them to publish some exposé. If we hide, it looks like guilt. Maybe we need to face this head-on. Show them we're united. That we care about each other. He hesitated, something raw in his eyes. Show them how. For a moment, she considered the suggestion that hovered at the edge of her mind, unsure if it was too drastic. But the alternative, letting the rumor machine paint them as frauds, seemed worse. We go public, she said softly, her pulse drumming in her ears. Give a real interview, not just some staged photo op. Explain how we met and what led us to marry so quickly. If we appear candid and open, maybe it undermines the narrative that we're hiding something. His jaw tightened, though he didn't dismiss the idea outright. That means letting the press pry into our personal lives. More eyes on us. More questions. If we slip up. We don't slip, she said, a tremor in her voice that she tried to quell. We hold to our story. But we make it believable, include enough genuine detail that the public sees we're more than just a corporate arrangement. Ezra studied her, tension radiating from him. Then he nodded, almost to himself. All right. Let's do it. We'll contact the top business magazine, the one with moderate credibility. We'll spin it as a rare chance to learn about my personal life, my new bride included. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. The board will be forced to watch, and maybe it'll silence whoever's stirring up trouble. She forced a slight smile, trying to project confidence she didn't fully feel. I'll be ready. A faint warmth filled her at his trust, overshadowed by the fear of just how cunning these reporters could be. It took only 24 hours for the interview to be arranged. On a drizzly afternoon, a journalist from a well-regarded business publication arrived at the estate with a photographer. They were promptly ushered into one of the sitting rooms, an elegant space lined with understated artwork. Callista perched beside Ezra on a love seat, heart pounding, as the journalist tested their recorder and the photographer adjusted lighting. When the questions began, it felt surreal. They asked about how they met, how their romance blossomed. Ezra and Callista tag-teamed the answers, weaving half-truths with just enough genuine remarks about their working relationship to lend authenticity. Occasionally, the journalist tossed out pointed inquiries about the timing, why the sudden marriage now, right when investors expressed concern over the company's leadership stability. Callista responded with a gentle smile, referencing how they realized life was too short to wait for the perfect moment. She felt the slight tremble in her hands, but she held firm to her part of the story. As the interview went on, something shifted. She found herself speaking less mechanically, recalling small moments she genuinely shared with Ezra, conversations at the office, quiet dinners. Her voice softened without her meaning it to, as though she was unwittingly tapping into an intimacy that wasn't entirely manufactured. Ezra, too, seemed calmer, occasionally sending her a fleeting look of gratitude or nodding in agreement with her narrative. Even the photographer seemed to sense a gentler energy between them, snapping a few unposed shots that felt oddly intimate. By the time the journalist finished, an odd hush settled in the air. The reporter packed up, thanked them politely, and left with the photographer, promising to send the final piece for their approval before publication. When the door closed behind them, Callista realized she was breathing shallowly, adrenaline still racing through her veins. She caught Ezra's eye, and they shared a faint, weary smile, an acknowledgement of the performance they'd just delivered. That might buy us time, he said quietly, leaning back against the couch cushion. If the article paints us as a real couple, the board member stirring trouble will look like a conspiracy theorist. Callista nodded, but she couldn't help the swirl of conflicting emotions in her chest. The charade had grown more elaborate, yet part of her had felt strangely authentic while describing the small joys of her relationship with Ezra. I just hope we convinced them, she murmured, pushing her hair back. He reached out, giving her hand a quick, gentle squeeze. We did. We'll be all right. His voice held a note of reassurance she hadn't heard before. After the journalist's departure, they wandered onto the estate's terrace, the late afternoon sky tinged with soft grays and pinks. A cool breeze rustled the surrounding trees. They stood there side by side, letting the calm wash over them. Callista's gaze flicked to the simple gold band on her finger. There was no doubt that their marriage was still a sham built on necessity, but each passing day blurred the boundary between fact and fiction. She found herself wondering whether this improbable bond might one day transcend the contract that created it. A quiet part of her clung to that hope, even as caution warned her not to let illusions take root. Ezra turned toward her, meeting her eyes with a look she couldn't fully decipher. Neither spoke. The hush of the moment felt charged, as though they both sensed a crack forming in their carefully maintained facade. In the distance, thunder rumbled, portending rain. Yet in that small instant, wrapped in the hush of fading daylight, it felt as though they were on the threshold of something neither of them had planned for, a place where genuine connection might spark in the midst of a pretense. As the first raindrops began to fall, they retreated indoors, exchanging quiet, thoughtful glances that no longer belonged solely to a staged marriage. And though neither dared voice it aloud, each felt the faint stirring of a possibility far more shocking than any investor meltdown, that an arrangement born in desperation might yield the seeds of something real and redeeming, something they couldn't have fathomed when they first agreed to tie their fates together for the sake of the company.